It's a great pleasure for me to be present here. This is the first conference ever held in the United States on the inner dimension of Islam, its intellectual and spiritual aspects in relation to the perennial philosophy. And I hope, inshallah, it will not be the last. Before beginning, I want to say that, first of all, I don't believe in coincidences of this order, but today coincides with the 15th of Sha'ban of the lunar Islamic calendar, which is one of the holiest days of the Islamic year. In the Sunni world, it's associated with the Miraj, the nocturnal ascent of the Prophet of Islam, and in the Shiite world with the birth of the Mahdi. It's celebrated throughout the Islamic world very, very extensively. And so those who are Muslims in the audience, Mabruk, for this holy day. But the fact that we're assembled here on the 15th of Sha'ban, I don't think is at all an accident. When we chose this date, it was the day that the auditorium was available and so forth, the external factors, but it was not a coincidence. It was a very holy day that we meet here today. And inshallah, we'll do something that will be pleasing in the eyes of God. Also, before I begin, as many of you who are Muslims know the famous hadith, Man la yashkur al-makhluq la yashkur al-khaliq. He who does not thank the creature does not thank God. As an advisor, standing outside, advising these young people who have organized this conference, especially three people, Rana Shia, Pervez Bhatti, and Fahim Chishti. These three young people have worked hundreds of hours really in making this event possible. And as someone who's done a lot of conferences in Iran and Europe here, I know how difficult such a task is, and on my own behalf, I want to thank them, and I think on behalf of everybody else here. What they did was for the sake of knowledge, of the truth, of beauty, and not for the sake of any compensation. Now, I've been assigned and I've accepted to give two lectures, one this morning and one the next morning, to set up the background, really, the general background and framework for all the discussions that are to take place during these 2 days by leading scholars from different areas and dealing with different subjects. So the theme that was assigned to me is very inclusive, including religion, metaphysics, philosophy, Sufism, and art. But from the point of view of the Islamic tradition, the traditional point of view, and its relation, of course, to the perennial philosophy. I want to start with some definitions. Many of you in this room are aware, that many of you are not, of how we use the word tradition, how it's used in this conference, in this event, and in the books, many of which you find outside there, and in many other facets that are gradually becoming known. The word tradition, as many of you know, comes from the Latin word traditio, and in the Latin Catholic tradition, it means the qualitative and quantitative addition of various orders and sayings and injunctions of the church over the ages. So the traditio builds up. It's not in that sense that we use the word traditio at all. Traditio also goes back to the root of transfer. In fact, it's the same etymological root, to transmit, to transfer, to go from one place to another, to give something from one place to another. Now, the assemblage of all these different meanings in Western languages caused this remarkable man, René Guénon, who's at the left, that's Friedrich Schuon and René Guénon, the two great masters of traditional school, at the upper part of this picture, the man who is a French person on your left, on my right, to bring up the usage of the term in a new way, but at the same time old traditional way, at the beginning of the 20th century, from about 1904, 1905, when he was a very young man and became acquainted with this strand of Shadri Sufism coming from Italy to France that nobody really knows about. A very, very secret movement that very few people have studied. And they began to use the word tradition, and sort of came to him as a kind of inspiration to distinguish it from what? From that which is cut off from a divine source, that is modernism, or any philosophy, or any worldview, which is either purely humanly centered, homocentric, or unfortunately subhumanly, as we have now, based purely on materialism or anything else like that. And therefore, the term is to be understood as dealing with the sacred, that which comes from the sacred, that which contains the sacred, and that which transmits the sacred. And therefore, in its deepest sense, is related to religion. Because religion, as we all know, comes from the Latin word religat, which means to bind, to tie. It's what ties us to God. And I've said oftentimes how profound these roots are to understand. In order to define ourselves vis-a-vis God, we have to go back to their inner meaning. And in Islam, we have a very different set of meanings. The word that corresponds actually to religion in meaning in Islam is aql. Means exactly the same as religat in Latin. That which you bind. What does aql come from originally? The string with which you bound the camel to a tree or something, it won't run away, or a horse. That which binds you, to ties you, is what ties us to God. Aql is what ties us to God. And the word religion in Latin means the same thing as aql, whereas the word for religion in Arabic, the word deen, is something else related to what we owe to God, dain. There are many roots given for the word deen. In ad-din inda Allahi al-Islam is the most universal term used in the Quran for religion. It means actually what we owe to God, and therefore all our relationship with the divine, all that we have to give back to God. Because everything we are has a back to it, because it comes from God. And nothing originates with us. All we do is a response to the divine act of existentiation that has made us what we are, and therefore a question of response. Now, tradition, as we understand it, embraces the old meaning of religat, the old meaning of deen, and aql, which I shall deal in a moment. So when we talk about the Islamic tradition, in our context, people like myself, and these my great predecessors, all of whom have died, but there are many young people sitting in this room itself, or traditional scholars and writers. How we define it means the Islamic tradition. For both the origin, the divine revelation, that which comes from Allah Ta'ala, from God, and in every religion comes from God. There's no religion that doesn't come from God, otherwise it's not religion from our point of view. Every religion begins a vertical act. The vertical act of descent of a truth from heaven. But tradition also includes then this horizontal expansion. Both that which comes from above, from the metaphysical, from the divine realm, and its expansion into the world of multiplicity, into the world in which we live. And every descent from heaven creates a new civilization, or a new phase in a civilization. Every civilization, we believe, is based on tradition. When we say modern civilization, which is against Christianity, it nevertheless is living from the breadcrumbs of the table of Christianity. What is all the ethics that remains in Washington that prevents people from cutting each other's head on M Street? What is it that remains? Why is it people are not killing more each other? They're doing a good job, but more than they do a couple of streets down here. It's what remains of Christian ethics. No matter what atheist says in what university, that's the historical fact. It's the historical fact. And so tradition means both that which descends from heaven and that which then spreads to create a civilization. Ananda Kumar Swami, in his remarkable article, What is Civilization?, one of the greatest works ever written on this matter, brings that out very carefully, that in Sanskrit also, when you talk about civilization, you mean a divine order originally. Islamic civilization, Chinese, Japanese, Hindu, Buddhist of Southeast Asia, Christian, so forth and so on. They're all civilizations, great civilizations, with art, with architecture, philosophy, books, theology, social structure, everything. But the origin, the beginning, is always in a revelation. And that is the perspective which we have when we talk about the Islamic tradition or any tradition. And because of that, we who are traditionalists also have respect for all traditions. And this is where the perennial philosophy comes in directly into the perspective of Islam. I shall talk about it in a minute. What do I mean by that? We mean that every time you have a revelation, God says I. He utters I. And that echo creates a whole world order. But God has said I more than once. God has said I more than once. And no matter how exclusive we become, and unfortunately Muslims are learning very fast to become exclusive, like exclusive Christians and also secularized Europeans are very exclusivist, who consider the West as the only civilization, as the only form. Globalization means Westernization, not Japanization or Chineseization. It means Westernization. This is an inheritance of this exclusivism. We in the Islamic world have always believed, certainly the Quran asserts, and if you look at the Bible, it's the same. God has said I more than once. And so we have more than one revelation. There's more than one universe in which the echo of the divine I reverberates. A Hindu has a right, when he hears Om, to hear the divine sound, because that's how God uttered his name in the Hindu world. Whereas the Jews don't pronounce the name of God at all, waiting for the Messiah to come, because God forbade them from pronouncing it. And in the middle of this, we Muslims have been given the supreme name of God. And so when we say God, Allah, that sound in our universe is God saying I. But externally, it doesn't sound like Om. It doesn't sound like Om or other prayers like this. But inwardly, it is that I repeating itself. And so the traditional point of view is based on, first of all, the authenticity of every manifestation of the divine, and secondly, the nexus, the connection between the origin and the source, and the spread over ages of history and periods of time. And this is exactly related to the perennial philosophy, which is based on the idea that there's a perennial wisdom that has always been and will always be. This Sanatara Dharma of Hinduism, to which I shall come in a moment. Now, turn to the Islamic tradition. My duty has been given to me by the conveners to sort of define what the different aspects of the Islamic tradition and also the perennial philosophy. Let me begin with the Islamic tradition. There's so much of the name of Islam mentioned in newspapers today that we really forget that Islam is not either a monolithic structure nor a uni-level reality. That Islam has many different aspects of its structure, that many levels of reality, and it's not exhausted by any single interpretation of it. You have on the external level the division between Sunnis and Shiites, the four schools of Sunni law, Ismailism, other schools, the Zahirites, and so forth and so on. I will not get into all those details of various divisions in the external structure of the Islamic Ummah, Islamic people, but it also has a vertical division which is being denied by many people in the Islamic world today, who are influenced by two things, both of which are very related together but seem antithetical outwardly. By modernism coming from the West, and by fundamentalism, which is supposedly anti-modernist, but it's really modernist. It's the other side of the same coin. Both refuse to accept the inner dimension of the Islamic tradition. And so if someone like me says something like that, say, oh, look at all those Muslims being paid, of course, by Saudi money that was put in their bank at the end of the month. I'm sorry, it's the end of my life. I don't care what these people say. buying people off. Salafis, Wahhabis here and there, there's no such thing as the inner meaning of religion. The Quran's meaning is only the outward. Although the Quran itself it says that God is al-awwal wal-akhir wal-dhahir wal-batin, but we will not pay attention to that. The Quran really doesn't. God at that time wasn't really paying attention himself. So let's get to what the Wahhabi Sheikh said, not what God and the Prophet said. That's not important. That's the kind of world we live among these people who have money, who have power, who have friends a few streets down from where we're standing, or protecting them, and the truth. Now the tail of the rooster is coming out, of course, as we say in Persian, but who usually keep these things hidden. But that's not Islam. That's not real Islam. Don't pay attention to the sounds. We've got 14 centuries of Islamic history. 14 centuries of Islamic history. The structure of which I speak has always been there. That is a relation between Islam, Iman, Ihsan. That goes back to the hadith of the Prophet, the hadith Jibreel. That is, one day the Prophet was sitting down, and a 16-year-old, very handsome man came out of the desert without any dust on his clothing and sat cross-legged next to him and started questioning the Prophet and said, "What is Islam? Ma al-Islam?" And then asked him, "What is Iman? Ma al-Iman?" And finally asked him, "What is Ihsan? Ma al-Ihsan?" And to each the Prophet gives a response. This is called the Hadith Jibreel and contains the whole of the Islamic teachings, if you really understand it. Because in what is Islam, the Prophet talks about accepting La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah, and the arkan, the prayers, the fasting, and so on and so on. What is Iman? Iman is to have faith in God and the Day of Judgment, and is the angels and the prophets and so forth and so on. And then what is Ihsan? It's so beautifully defined. It's to pray and to live as if you saw God. And ta'budu, that you worship as if you saw God. And if thou or you do not see him, he sees you. If you can live like that, we're among the muhsinin. We have ihsan, the highest aspect of Islam. It's the saying of the Prophet of Islam. Anyone who goes against is going against a very strong hadith accepted by every muhaddith of the Sunni world, by Bukhari, by Tirmidhi, by Muslim. I'm going to talk about the Shia world, the Sunni world, the six Sitta. It's in every single one of them. It's one of the strongest hadiths we have in Islam. So we have actually the definition of what I'm saying, going back not to 20th century thinkers in Paris or Cairo, going back to the Quran, going back to the Prophet. Islam has always had this aspect of interiority. And from this interiority have grown two things. One, the Sufi orders, spiritual schools of practice, to which I shall turn soon or tomorrow, and intellectual aspects of Islam, the different intellectual schools and dimensions with which I shall also be dealing tomorrow, or some of it today. But it's important to keep in mind when we try to understand the Islamic tradition in relation to the perennial philosophy, that first of all, the Islamic tradition is not limited only to the social order. Of course, the Sharia is extremely important. Another tripartite division of Islam is the Sharia, al-Tariqa, al-Haqiqa. That is the divine law, the path to God, and the truth itself, which is the source of both the law and the way, the path and the law. A lot of people have forgotten that, but they have always existed. The law without the way can become like a shell, and the way without the law cannot exist. We've never had any walnut trees which give walnuts without a shell. If you find one, please show it to me. It's somewhere in nature you have an almond or walnut or whatever it is, has a shell, and inside it is the nut that you eat. So in religion, you have to have this external shell. It's absolute necessity. Sacred law is sacred. And I'm not one of those people, New Age Sufis, there are a lot of them in California and now some here, who try to denigrate and belittle the Sharia aspects of religion, as if we didn't need that to talk only about Sufism. No, It's not a disease in California. It's a disease in Tehran and Isfahan and Cairo and other places also. It's coming back to the Islamic world, especially into my country, Iran, where it's just total nonsense by people who know nothing at all about Irfan or Sufism, writing about Irfan or Sufism and then denigrating the Sharia itself. And that, of course, is not tradition. It's the counter-tradition. It's what Geron called the counter-tradition, what comes at the end of the world. So we have in Islam, despite everything, the survival to this day of the structured tradition in which you have either the law, the way, and the truth, if you like to call it, or, as I said before, the Sharia, the Tariqah, and Haqiqah. Now, another very important aspect of the Islamic tradition which relates it to the perennial philosophy is that in Islam, the very vocabulary used does not separate intellect from spirit. Let me clear this point up because it's a very, very important point. In European history, in European philosophy, after the Middle Ages, gradually the word intellectus in Latin lost its original meaning that had been used by St. Bonaventure or St. Thomas Aquinas, the great schoolman of the Middle Ages, Italian, French, German schoolman, St. Albertus Magnus, people like that, and became identified with reason. That, I believe, is the greatest tragedy of the Western mind. It occurs really with Descartes in the 16th, 17th century, in which intellect collapses into reason. I always say jokingly in my talks when in English, such a person intellectual. That means he listens to Mozart rather than jazz. I mean, that's what intellectual is. But to be intellectual is very difficult. That is to have the intellect in us to become activated, to become active. And that is totally out of the philosophical scene of Western thought since the 16th century, since the end of the Middle Ages. A few Italians in Bologna, it's talked about a bit later. But it ends up really, but at the end of the Middle Ages, gradually disappears. And as you know, the word intellectual really doesn't mean it the same thing as a spiritual. And unfortunately, as a friend of the Catholic Church, of Christianity, as a Muslim friend, I have to make this criticism. Unfortunately, this was accepted, especially by the Catholic Church. The Protestants didn't pay much attention to this debate. But the Catholic Church began to, in fact, praise a kind of anti-intellectual sentimentalism in religion, because it was facing the philosophical challenge of Feuerbach's and Karl Marx's and even Kant's and Hegel's, who were not completely atheists, but nevertheless who challenged, in fact, the traditional Christian view of God. And so, unfortunately, this idea grew even within the Catholic Church to oppose the word intellectuality to spirituality. Now, in the perennial philosophy, and especially in Islamic philosophy and Islamic tradition, this is not the case. This is not the case. One of the things that we could learn today, which will be with us throughout all these 2 days' lectures, is precisely this. We have two hadiths. أول ما خلق الله الروح أول ما خلق الله العقل. The first thing that God created was the spirit. Ruh corresponds to spiritus in Latin, not to anima. It corresponds to the Greek pneuma. And so, أول ما خلق الروح, the first thing that God created was the spirit. And the second, it's exactly the same thing, أول ما خلق الله العقل, the first thing that God created was the intellect. Now here it shows, in a sense, on the highest level, the equality of spirit and intellect, and how different that world is from the world in which we live, in which you have, on the one hand, people who think are very intellectual, who are logical positivists, pursuing modern Western philosophy, which is totally bereft of any spiritual dimension, in which the word spiritual doesn't mean anything. It's just a sentimental term that is used. Look at any philosophy department in the Anglo-Saxon world. I don't have to, just our own philosophy are just one block away. Or Georgetown, anywhere. Even Georgetown is a Catholic university, that's a little bit better. Catholic university itself is still teaching Catholic philosophy, that doesn't count. But other universities. So the rejection of the very category of spiritual. And then on the other hand, you have all the new age spirituality, which is totally intellectual. You're not supposed to think. And the two are totally separate from each other. The Islamic tradition is one in which the two are unified, and this is very, very important to understand. Now, I hope you have some inkling of the various aspects of the Islamic tradition. We'll be dealing with it more extensively with each lecture that will be given after myself, both this afternoon and tomorrow. And now let me say something about the perennial philosophy. This term did not exist in Aristotle and Plato. We do not have this term in Greek. We do not have this term in early Latin philosophy, Cicero, Virgil, people like that. It did not exist in Latin. It did not exist in the Middle Ages in Europe. It's very, very important. The term did not exist in Middle Ages in Europe. The first famous use of it is a letter written in 1711, I think, either 1710 or 1711. I used to have a good memory. Now it's going away because the only thing I should remember now is the name of God and forget everything else. So I'm not sure about 1710 or 1711, but somewhere around there, by the famous German philosopher Leibniz, who says, somebody asked me what philosophical school I follow. I follow the school of the perennial philosophy. Later scholarship showed that Leibniz had learned this from an Italian philosopher called Agostino Stoico, who was the librarian of the Vatican Library and who knew Arabic very well. And the research done by several people, including humble research by yours truly, has shown very, very clearly that the term perennial philosophy, philosophia perennis, in Latin comes from Arabic sources. And so let me say something about that. Without doubt. Not the reality, the word, the term. The term comes from the Islamic civilization. Otherwise, it would not be perennial philosophy. If the West had Plotinus and Plato and they're not perennial philosophers, who were they? So I'm not saying that the reality was that. I'm talking about the term, the terminology. In the Islamic context, the first time we encountered this term, exactly this term, not allusion to this term. Allusion comes in the 3rd century. The first time we have the exact term is the 4th Islamic century, 10th Christian century. But the use of the Persian term Javidan Kharad, Javidan Khrad. I'm sorry, we don't have a blackboard here, Javidan Kharad, because not everybody knows Persian here. By the great philosopher from Isfahan, Ibn Moskouye, whom the Arabs pronounce as Miskaway, because Uye doesn't exist in Arabic, that Persian sound, so it's away, like Sibaway. Sibuye becomes Sibaway. Ibn Miskaway, they say in Arabic, and also in the West, is Ibn Moskouye, a great philosopher from Isfahan, who wrote a book called Javidan Kharad. The first paragraph of which is in Arabic, only the title is in Persian. The book is in Arabic. The very first paragraph of which he says that divine wisdom was handed down by God to the mythical emperor Hossein, Persian emperor, it's a mythical figure, going back to Persian mythology, and to the ancient Greeks. So the idea that philosophy was always around, this idea is expressed in the term Javidan Kharad, which then in the text he uses also is translated into Arabic al-hikmatul khalida. Al-hikmatul khalida. Hikmah in Arabic means wisdom, but also philosophy, also theosophy. And khalid in Arabic means perpetual. It doesn't mean eternal. Many of my own students, or even Arabs, mistranslate the word khalid into eternal. Khalid in Arabic is different from abad or abadi, which means eternal. Khalid means perpetual. perennial. Perennial philosophy doesn't say eternal philosophy. It says perennial philosophy. When you have flowers called perennials, what does that mean? They're always green. That means there's perpetuity. Perpetuity in time, where eternity represents another level of reality. So it's perennial philosophy, which in Arabic is hikmatul khalida. In Persian, Javidan is nebulous because it can mean both. Our soul is Javidan. It's eternal. But also you can say Fakhr Javidan Yek Millat. That is the perpetual honor of a country in Persian, or many, many other phrases. So it had both meanings inside. So it became known as Hikmatul Khalida. And then Sohrawardi, one of the great propagators of perennial philosophy, was very much aware of this, who spoke about the perennial philosophy, who developed the idea of the perennial philosophy long before Huxley or anybody else. He also speaks of Hikmatul Atiqa. Atiqa means ancient. It's Atiqajat before in Persian. Atiqa, Al-Hikmatul Atiqa, which was translated into Latin verbatim as Philosophia Prescorum. The Philosophia Prescorum, which means Atiq, that is ancient philosophy. So these terms came about in the Islamic world, and they entered the West in the 5th and 6th Islamic century, 11th, 12th centuries. There's no doubt about that. And gradually the idea of the perennial philosophy came to be known in the West, but nobody used it. It was kept in books until we got past the Middle Ages into the Renaissance with Augustinus Stoico, which in Rome, the librarian of the Vatican. Now, this term, to conclude the usage of this term, since I'm speaking English now, continued its usage in Persian and Arabic. It was never lost. But in the West, very few people spoke about it after Leibniz. For example, there were some Catholic thinkers in Belgium and France at the end of the 19th century who referred to it as perennialists. And one or two people here and there. It was not very much used. If you look at histories of Western philosophy in the 18th century, 19th century, nobody used the perennial philosophy. Things began to change completely in the 20th century. There are two channels for this. It's very important. It's one of the most important terms being used in English today. When we talk about metaphysics and esotericism and so forth, the term perennial philosophy is very popular now. What happened? Two very different channels. On the one hand, the traditionalists started with Guénon, but many other people writing in French began to speak of la philosophie pérenne in French, perennial philosophy, and became discussed a great deal in French before English. French was a prime language for this school that begins before the Second World War, from the 1920s, a lot of discussions going on. Then, after the Second World War, the famous English writer Aldous Huxley, novelist, wrote a book called The Perennial Philosophy. His brother was an atheist, Julian Huxley, famous atheist, who was a professor of biology and England's most famous atheist at that time, who was a virulent atheist. One of the tragedies of Britain is that both it rains a lot and it produces a lot of atheists these days. I hope, inshallah, the sun will come out and they will also clear the mind of all these foggy people. Foggy minds. Especially the last 20 years, it's really amazing. The French, who used to be specialists in producing atheists, haven't produced one famous atheist the last 20 years. The English, who weren't thinking about these things very much, now are the center of it. But actually, you had also another wave. I said that jokingly, but on purpose. Aldous Huxley was very much disturbed by the intellectual scene at Oxford and Cambridge and England of that time. but the world in which his brother and his friends were all together talking about this, all this agnosticism and indifference to tradition and religion. And as Kumar Swami once wrote, he said, you do no longer discuss the name God in polite English society. That was in the 1920s before he migrated to Boston. He was very tired of that world and began to turn, as happened so much in the after the Second World War, to Oriental thought. He was interested in Hinduism and Sufism and Buddhism and so forth. And he wrote a book called The Perennial Philosophy. He moved to California, unfortunately, in many ways, because California became the center of pseudo-perennial philosophy. And all this New Age wave begins from there. It was a parody of the Mahdi appearing in the West. The first time in history, which have influence coming from the far west to the east. Influences always were from the east to the west. So it's a kind of reversal of poles, as Guénon would say. But anyway, he settled there, and other people like Alan Watts and others, a number of Englishmen and some Americans, sort of made a kind of quotes unquote intellectual center around Los Angeles, and began to talk about the perennial philosophy. And his book became very famous, the book Perennial Philosophy. It was translated to French, German, even Persian, Turkish, I don't know if it was in Arabic or not, but anyway, appeared in many different languages. The one good thing that was in this book is that Huxley had assembled a large amount of quotations from different religions to show how similar they were, how in deep things. You have it from Dhammapada, the Upanishads, the Quran, the Rumi, Meister Eckhart, this, that. It's a remarkable structure that exists of similarity without identity of various traditions. But it didn't have the intellectual structure behind it. Intellectual structure as a response, in fact, also to this kind of Huxleyite, let's call it perennial philosophy, came with the reassertion of the meaning of the perennial philosophy by Friedrich Schwann. More than anybody else. And when I edited a collection of the essays of Schwann with his own permission in London in 1977 for the Festival of the World of Islam, I chose the title Islam and the Perennial Philosophy. I went to Lausanne and I convinced him that he should accept that title. And he did. It's a very, very important book of his. And he's written brilliant pages on the perennial philosophy. Remarkable. The works of he and Guénon on this term perennial philosophy and its meaning are unmatched. And that one essay of Kumar Swami, these great men, we owe them so much. We owe them so much. They clarified what the perennial philosophy really is. Of course, it took on a mutation. In America, everything takes on mutation. Even the French croissant was this small, now it's like this. So every country has a mutation. So this also had a mutation. And gradually they began to use the word perennialism instead of the perennial philosophy. And people were called perennialists. Oftentimes called the perennialist. This is a new term. It was not used by Guénon and Schwann in this way. But now it's become popular, right? So if you see the term perennialist, sometimes used pejoratively. It's that. The study Quran, when it came out, so people who were against it, many of them were against it because so that I defend the perennial philosophy, so I'm against the Quran. Whereas the Quran is the most perennialist of all sacred scriptures that we have, along with the Tao Te Ching. So the Tao Te Ching doesn't talk about the other traditions. The Quran does, specifically. There's no text, no sacred text that is close to the perennial philosophy as the Quran. Has actual verses. أَيْنَمَا تَوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. Wherever you turn, there's the face of God. That's the heart of perennial philosophy. Where do you find a verse like this? Anywhere. So Schwann believed it was his function, duty, to bring out the meaning of the perennial philosophy and to understand perennial in that sense. But you should know the mutations that also came about in America after he settled here, after the discussion began, and it still is going on. Is going on by both who are pro and those who are against the perennial philosophy. Now, does one find a term like the perennial philosophy in the Quran itself? Was it invented by the Persian philosopher Ibn Moskouye? The answer is, although the term was used by him, the meaning is to be found in the Quran also, in a very, very direct way. I want to analyze two terms for you to conclude my talk for today. I'm sorry I began 23 minutes late, and I was told I should still give the 1-hour lecture, so I should have stopped. But I've been given this assignment, so I want to keep to my promise. And I think this is an important point to bring out. The two terms of the Quran, Quranic terms, I want to analyze, see how close they are to the perennial philosophy, and if they are the perennial philosophy. One is the word ad-din, religion. It's usually translated as religion. But it's much more universal than that. It's really tradition in the most universal sense. The Quran says, "Inna ad-din 'inda Allahi al-Islam." Verily, the deen, let me just use the Arabic now, D-I-N, not translate it. The deen with God is Islam. This is taken by many modern Muslims who are exclusivists, much more than grandfather was in Lahore 100 years ago. Modern, the younger the Muslims are, the more exclusivist they become. It's very funny. That's one of the strange things that are going on. You expect that it would be the other way around. But for very complicated reasons, that's not always the case. I'm proud to say that I'm not more exclusive than my father, but he was also a universalist. I should try just to be as universal as he was. I cannot be more universalist than he. Anyway, many young Muslims say, doesn't the Quran say that Islam is the only religion? It says the religion with God, the deen with God is Islam. And my answer to them, I said, yes, but Islam does not mean only the religion brought by the Prophet. It's not only the religion of the Quran. The Quran itself calls Abraham a Muslim. And it brings the word Islam with the second word Hanif. Kana Ibrahim Musliman Hanifan, and calls Christ a Muslim. So obviously, Islam does not mean only what began 1400 years ago. Otherwise, the Quran, astaghfirullah, would be lying. It means actually surrender to God. To surrender to God. And human reality begins with surrender to God. Had Adam not done istighfar and surrendered to God, we would have not had any human history. The whole chain of prophecy is based on surrender to God, going back to the origin of humanity. So the word deen, in the deepest sense, means tradition as we understand it, in the deepest sense, because it is not only religion as one among many things, it is the source of everything. In traditional Islamic civilization, nothing was separated from deen. Even how you made shoes, how you cooked food, everything was related in some way to deen. Look at all the things that was sacralized. For example, halwa, the sweetmeats that we Persians and Arabs like so much. It was a religious act to make halwa. It's not a religious act to make apple pie here on M Street and go buy a piece. It's a secularized activity, but that was a religious activity. Every part, whether in Lahore or Tehran or Cairo or Fez, any part of the Islamic world, everything is sacralized. So the deen is everywhere. That's what we mean by tradition. The second word, Hanif, very, very difficult to translate. The best translation for the word Hanif is primordial. Al-Hunafa could be called primordialists, that is perennial philosophers. There were people who from the very beginning accepted Tawheed. We believe in Islam that Hunafa were there from the very beginning. That's why Abraham is called Hanifan. A person who accepted the unity of the divine principle and all that flows from that was called a Hanif, a primordialist. And these two terms bind very, very closely the whole of the Islamic tradition to the perennial philosophy, as understood traditionally, not in New Age way, as understood traditionally, as a wisdom that always was and always will be. Islam believes there were 124,000 prophets. All of them believed in La ilaha illallah. That is, all of them believed in divine unity. That is the perennial philosophy. No one said that perennial philosophy has not had many different expressions. The beautiful poetry of Hafiz or Rumi, among peaks of expressing perennial truth, they're in Persian, whereas Upanishads are in Sanskrit. Ibn al-Farid is in Arabic. Haiku is in Japanese, and so forth and so on. The forms do not have to be the same. In fact, the perennial philosophy itself has a philosophy as why you have diversity of forms. Emma Clark, who's not here with us, in her lecture on Islamic art, will explain some of that as far as Islamic art is concerned in the lecture I'll be read by Mr. Boylston this afternoon or tomorrow, whenever it is. Now, let me conclude. At the heart of the perennial philosophy of the Islamic point of view lies unity, lies Tawheed. And I said every prophet was a muwahhid, and every prophet invited every follower to Tawheed. We've never had a prophet in the sacred history of Islam who invited people to shirk, to polytheism. And don't forget that the prophets, although in the Quran the prophets are spoken of are Abrahamic prophets, one or two Arab prophets who were not in the Jewish line, but they don't talk, it doesn't talk about the Buddha or Zoroaster, the great prophets outside of the Semitic world. But it universalizes the function of prophecy. وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولًا, the Quran says. To every people we have sent a messenger. It didn't say only to the Arabs and the Jews or the Christians of France or something like that, or only to the Hindus or only to the Japanese. لِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ, to every people we have sent, every community we have sent a prophet. And so every prophet came to teach Tawheed. And that's the basis of so many beautiful poems in Persian and Arabic about the continuity of the pervading functions. A remarkable poem, the Gulshan-e-Raz of Shah Mahmud Shabastari. It says, Ism Ahmad, Ism Kull Anbiyast. The name of Ahmad, the Prophet of Islam, the name of every prophet. What would be clearer than that? Ism Ahmad, Ism Kull Anbiyast. So Tawheed for us is at the heart of all religions. And we're here to assert Tawheed. And so the doctrine of Tawheed, of course, is fundamental to the Islamic tradition, from the Sharia to metaphysics, to philosophy, to Sufism, to all authentic Islamic arts, and even the traditional Islamic sciences. Tomorrow, inshallah, I shall deal with these in particularity. Today, I'll try to lay out the background for you of the relation between Islamic tradition and the perennial philosophy. And tomorrow, I shall deal with metaphysics, with hikmah, with philosophy, which is related to it, which is not the same thing as metaphysics, strictly speaking, in contrast to what people think in the West. Going back, in fact, to Aristotle, the mistake made from the Greek period, to Sufism. I wish I had more time to talk about it, but to some extent I shall. Lay the background for the Islamic arts, about which there will be a separate lecture. And I was trying to say just a few words about the traditional sciences. In fact, it's the only subject I know a little bit about, but it was not part of the program. The conveners did not ask me to speak about that, but I would say a few words about that. And inshallah, I shall see you tomorrow. I'll be ready for any question that you want to have, and he will field them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nasr. For the question and answer period, there's a microphone stand in the central aisle. And if you would be so good as to make a line at the microphone. And I think the best way to do this is, rather than take a whole list of questions, unless you have a preference, I would like to take one question at a time. And
I prefer that.
All right, all right. So the microphone is there, and if you have a question, please feel free to stand up. And would you like them to introduce themselves?
You're the boss.
Yeah, it's true, right? All right. Perhaps just give your name and if you have an affiliation, and try to make your questions rather than lectures. We've had our lecture. We just make a specific question related to what Dr. Nasr has just spoken about. Thank you. Please.
Hi, my name is Kyle Walker, and I am an individual, I guess.
I can't hear a word he's saying.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Yeah.
I can't hear.
Oh, you can't hear me. Maybe. Is it better now?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I guess for me, I'm just having a little trouble understanding the intellectual argument for the unity of all of the religions. And I think it might be helpful if you could tell us what you think is the strongest objection to the idea that there's a unity in all the religions, and what your response is to that.
But we'll go back here so everyone hears me. Did everyone hear the question?
Could you repeat the question?
The question was, what is the strongest objection that there is a unity between religions? This is a very profound question. First of all, psychologically and humanly, we cannot live on two planets at the same time. We cannot be in two places at the same time. We have to have a sense of belonging. We have to have a sense of belonging. And God, having realized that, has put in our heart a sense of the absolute in the religion in which we believe. Anyone who believes his religion is just relative completely is wasting his time practicing that religion. Because if a religion leads to God, who is absolute, there must be something of the absolute in that religion to allow one to reach God. So we begin first of all with this point. It's a very, very important point. Secondly, the diversity of human types necessitated the diversity of the divine messages. Why isn't there only one religion? Why isn't there just a religio perennis? It's because through God's wisdom, whether we understand it or not, the diversity in God's creation, that the creative power of God is infinite. And that infinity prevented from only one type of creation, one type of human being. And so we have a diversity of human beings, racial types, ethnic types, cultural types, human types, all of these. So this diversity also requires a diversity of messages, but they're always tailored externally to that diversity while inwardly being the same thing. I'm not saying that all religions are saying the same thing on all levels. I never said that. In fact, that's totally false. That's a pseudo-perennial philosophy that we have today. What I'm saying is that what Ananda Kumaraswamy wrote in his beautiful article, Paths That Lead to the Same Summit. You should all read that essay by Ananda Kumaraswamy, Paths That Lead to the Same Summit. That every religion is like a path on a mountain. If you've done mountain climbing, when I was young, I did a lot of mountain climbing. Marco Pallis used to be a great mountain climber. That's why he went to Tibet. But he didn't know it was to climb the mountain of Buddhism. He went as an Englishman originally from Greece and ended up as a Buddhist, as a Tibetan Buddhist. A great mountain climber. He and I used to climb the Alps, but he was a whole generation older than I. He was climbed like a goat. I dragged behind. I couldn't catch up with him. But in mountain climbing, each path is different from the other path. And when you're on a particular path, you see different countryside. You don't see the same thing. But the higher you go, the path comes closer together. Until when you reach the very top, there's only one point. That's where God is. And there the view becomes the same of the cosmos in a sense. The people who stand on top of Mount Everest, they all see, they turn around, the same horizon. Below, if you're on one side of the mountain and somebody's on the other side of the mountain, you see two different landscapes even. That's where different cosmologies, different sacred arts. But in those traditional arts, there's always the Tawhid, there's always the one. There's always that unity. And that is why you have this paradox which modern man cannot understand. The more particular the traditional form, the more universal its inner content. By breaking traditional forms, you do not become universal. You cut yourself off from universality. That's why we are in favor of completely traditional music, completely traditional miniature. I love Mughal miniatures and Rajput miniatures. They're Indian. They're different from Persian. Persian miniatures are very different. But I'm 100% in favor of the Persian tradition of miniatures keeping its tradition and the Rajput keeping its, not mixing them together like Jagatai and some people have done in Pakistan. You may not know this, in the history of modern painting in the subcontinent. Worse than that is music. You're going to have a very rare example of what I'm saying tomorrow night, when we're going to have a Persian musician and an Indian musician, both at the very top, major musicians, playing together without bastardization of the tradition, without relativization, but having a dialogue together. That would be a very important spiritual experience for all of us, because it's very rare, very rare. There are too many now people going back to when Shankara Yehudi Minyan brought out that record 40 years ago of somebody playing sarod and somebody else the violin, and then they get all intermingled together. And now some of our greatest Persian musicians, like, I don't want to name them now, are doing the same thing. The Persian music has been destroyed right before our eyes by people who are trying to mix these things together in a I call it the bastardly way. It's really bastard is a human being without a father. We don't know who his father is. That's what it means. Without a progeny, without a root. I'm using it in that sense. All right, next question.
Wael Azmi from Dayton, Ohio. Many people say that Buddhism is agnostic. I was wondering if you could relate to us Buddhism to perennial philosophy, and maybe you can qualify that notion.
That's a very good question. René Guénon, Sheikh Abdul Wahid Yahya, wrote nothing on Buddhism, practically. And the few words he wrote on Buddhism in his book, Introduction to Hindu Doctrine, which was his first major doctrinal work written at the end of the 1910s, was from the point of view of the Hindu Orthodox masters who had taught him Hinduism. And so from the point of view of Hinduism, ordinary Hinduism, Buddhism is heterodox. It's not orthodox. Exactly as Christianity is not orthodox from the point of view of Orthodox Judaism. The relationship between Christianity and Orthodox Judaism is very similar to the relation between Buddhism and Orthodox Hinduism. Islam doesn't have a comparative role because it doesn't have a religion coming after it like that. Baha'ism is another category, it doesn't count. Now, Buddhism, from the point of the traditionalists, is not heterodox. Marco Pallis, and later on Friedrich Schuon, carried out a long correspondence with Guénon and convinced him that his knowledge of Buddhism had not been correct at that time, and he recanted and realized that Buddhism is a major tradition. Some, like Ananda Kumaraswamy, has a little book called Hinduism and Buddhism. It's only 60 pages. It will take you 60 years to read. It's the most dense book probably ever written. It's an amazing book, but really amazing. Any sentence you learn from that book is better than 10 books written by some Harvard professor on Buddhism. There's no comparison. There's a little book called Hinduism and Buddhism, published in 1943 in New York, and republished, I think it's can be found. If not, you can go out to the library and get a copy. These days it's very easy. He interprets Buddhism in a kind of Vedantic way. And some Buddhists were not very happy about this. But if you talk to the Dalai Lama, Dalai Lama is a very good friend of mine. We've had 2 discourses, theological discourses together on the East Coast and the West Coast in the last 20 years. We talk to him. Of course, before everybody else is usually very sentimental and doesn't talk about metaphysics. But he's a very good metaphysician. And the best dialogue I had with him was in Delhi, and not here, where he was, another Dalai Lama came out and spoke in Tibetan. He didn't speak in English, had a translator. We had a discourse. He and I were the last people to speak in a major conference in Delhi, in which we had a dialogue together about metaphysics, about ultimate reality. So you find someone like the Dalai Lama, or some great Buddhist scholars. I've known some others, Japanese Buddhist scholars, who are my friends of mine. When you carry out a dialogue, they do not say that Buddhism is atheistic. It's non-theistic. That is, it does not talk about theos. It doesn't deny God. It doesn't talk about God. God is purely objective. It talks about the other pole of reality, which is the pure subject, the Buddha nature within. And it's not difficult to integrate that view into other traditions, even Islam. It's a very good book by a friend of mine, Dr. Reza Shah Kazemi of London, on Islam and Buddhism. And whoever asks this question, I suggest that you take a look at that book, in which brings out these issues very carefully. Because if Buddhism were simply agnostic, how could such an ethical system issue from agnosticism? How could such an art, the beautiful art of the caves, the Vajanta, of the early Buddhist art, and later Buddhist art, the Sung art of China, how could that come out of agnosticism? Where did that come from? So it's not that simple by trying to categorize Buddhism as agnostic. It's much more profound than that. A lot of Americans become Buddhists because they want to have a religion without having God. So they think they're agnostic or atheists, but they're Buddhists. That's not at all real, because spirituality has to have a source, the Buddha nature. Later on with Mahayana and Vajrayana in Tibet to develop. The Buddha nature really plays the role of God, except it's within us. Don't talk about the cosmic God sitting out there. All the Tibetans have a little bit of that. So this is an important issue, very, very important issue, the most difficult of all. Major religion of the world to integrate into the view of the perennial philosophy is Buddhism, but it's not impossible. This has already taken place. Yes, sir.
Good morning. My name is Emre Çelik from the Rumi Forum. I want to ask, what path should be followed to increase spirituality, both in the individual, in the broader Muslim community, and more broadly among all believers?
Could you repeat your question, the first part?
Yes. What path would you suggest, both people as individuals, as a community, and more broadly as a society of believers? Thank you.
First of all, to be with the tail end, he who wants to reform the world must first reform himself or herself. And no one can really reform the world without having reformed oneself. It's a great mistake of modernism. A lot of good intention is spent wanting to reform the world, but turning away from oneself, from the soul, to reform oneself. This is a great error, so which should be avoided. As to what path, there's a hadith of the Prophet said there are as many paths to God as there's the children of Adam. What does it mean there are 6 billion, 500 billion paths? But this means there are many. There are many paths to God. And it's very difficult to give an answer ex cathedra like this to a large audience because it differs from person to person. But I want to say this one word. It is not man who chooses the path, but the path that chooses man. This again is the Buddhist saying. It's not man, it's not we who choose the path chooses us. We're all destined. The important thing for us is to keep our interest, to want to find the path, to knock at the door. As Christ said, knock at the door. And then the door will open. And the door which is not meant for us, we will know. There are a lot of false gurus right now in the world. There's never been like this, so chaotic. There were always false masters. Even Rumi talks in the Masnavi. He says, don't extend your hand to everyone who claims to be a Sufi teacher. That's symbol of bayah, of spiritual initiatic bondage. So, but it's never been like our day. The same way that the earth has never been as polluted as now. The air of the earth, as far as we know. Never been as polluted as now. In the same way, the spiritual pollution has never been as great as it is now. So a lot of false teachers, a lot of false masters, they have a suave tongue, they say all kinds of things, but they're not real. So one should, first of all, who was asked the question sitting there? Yes. One should be earnest with oneself. Why do you want the path? If you love God, if you want to have a path that approaches seriously the divine reality, the first thing to do is to pray to God to open that path to you. That's the most important thing. That prayer has a reciprocity upon yourself that you do not understand. It's a kind of alchemical effect upon yourself. And just don't go as if you're trying to buy bread and see where the next bakery is. Because in the spiritual life, I said, God will never allow you to approach Him unless He wants you to approach Him. And so, in a difficult moment like this, but there's so many false paths, so many false teachers, try to be honest with yourself, sincere with yourself. That's very, very important. Keep your eyes open, try not to be fooled, and try to pray to God for guidance. He always provides it, and in very strange ways. Inshallah, you'll find what you're suited for. Last question. I think I know this man.
Yes, perhaps. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Nasr. It was wonderful hearing your lecture and your talk. What came out very beautifully is the explicit connection between Islam and the perennial philosophy, the explicitness in the Islamic revelation regarding the universality of revelation and wisdom. However, what I've noticed in many Muslims, and this relates to the sense of the absolute that you mentioned also, that Islam, being historically the final revelation, there is a strong theological and psychological hang-up for many Muslims regarding the exclusive validity of Islam as the final revelation. That, or in other words, that although Islam recognizes all the religions and their origin in prophecy, that recognition for many Muslims is rooted in the finality of Islam, or rather the exclusive validity of Islam. How does one, from this perspective, reconcile that tension or that obstacle?
The issue he's addressing is a very important issue right now. Go ahead, don't get tired just standing up. I'll answer you. Which has very deep political repercussions as well as religious ones. Debate that is going on in the Islamic world today about the multiplicity of religions, about inclusivism and exclusivism. I made allusion a few minutes ago to the young in the Islamic world were being more closed and exclusive than their ancestors. It's a very strange phenomenon that is taking place. Usually in the West, the young are more open than their parents. Almost every student we have in this university, I'm a teacher here, who's doing religious studies or Islamic studies or Hindu studies, is much more interested in the universal religion than his or her parents in Minnesota or Michigan or somewhere in the Midwest. There's no doubt about that. But in the Islamic world, and also in the Hindu world, in the Hindu world, these two religions, which are the strongest living religion in the world today, which only place where we find million people worshiping, and very, very powerful, still socially and humanly in both religions, there's a tendency towards more and more exclusivism, so-called fundamentalism. And that is, of course, a very great tragedy. And what Dr. Awan was referring to, is a friend of mine, was precisely this, that many people in the Muslim world now, young people, even some of them educated, say they associate universality with finality of Islam, saying that if Islam is the final religion, there can only be one final religion. How can religious truth be universal? That's a false argument, completely false argument. First of all, why does not one verse of the Quran? I think Dr. Dagley is going to deal with this also later on. I don't want to sort of steal his thunder. I want you to explain this more fully later. But briefly, why does not one verse of the Quran clearly abrogate the religions before Islam? Why is it there's so many verses of the Quran which address religion universally? Why are there so many verses which specifically say Muslims and Christians and Jews and Sabians, these four I usually said, and then leaving the door for others? Why is this so? Why is it that the Prophet, coming to the Hadith and the Sunnah from the Quran, allowed Christians to celebrate Mass in his two-room apartment in Medina? There are 20 records of that. This is the Prophet of Islam. Why did he have Christian friends? Why did he have Jewish friends? Why did he protect those Jews who did not fight against him, and those Christians who did not fight against him? Why did he act as he did in Najran? These are facts of Islamic history that no one can deny. So we have to distinguish, we who I think have a very special role to play at this stage of Islamic history. I mean those people who understand the universal character of Islam, have to rely on two very important arguments. One is to point to Islamic history. I said, look, you cannot be better Muslims than the Turks were at the time of Suleiman. They never missed their prayers. They never stopped paying zakat. They never stopped their fasting. How many Jews did they protect when the Jews were being massacred in Europe? How many thousands of Jews settled in Istanbul alone? How many became ministers? Not only bankers, ministers in the Ottoman court. You cannot change history. How many in Persia? How many Christians and Jews in Iran were very wealthy? They lived very well. They had all kinds of functions. In Iran, they never became ministers like they did in Turkey, but they're very high functions. Look at all the Hindus that served in the Muslim governments in India, by Hindu rulers and wazirs who surely were not less pious than some graduate student living in the dorm here. I mean, we forget who we are. Sometimes really we forget who we are. We forget that our ancestors, how they lived according to religion, how they feared God. And we criticize them as if we knew better than they did. So this is one argument, that arguing from the point of Islamic history. Secondly, you should tell them that we cannot go against the text of the Quran and what flows from it. The Quran orders all Muslims to protect the life, property, and work of Christians and Ahlul Kitab, other Ahlul Kitab. There are many, many verses of the Quran. It's an argument that I once mentioned to you, which is indubitable. Nobody can argue against it. If all Christians and Muslims are going to go to hell, how could God tell us to protect them in this world so we'll be sure to go to hell after a long life in this world? There will be more and more bad things. What kind of God would that be, astaghfirullah? Why is it that it's incumbent upon us to protect the religious minorities in the Islamic world? There's no answer to that. The Wahhabis and the Salafis, absolutely no answer to that. If it was not for the fact that God wanted them to live also. Can there be another answer? If you're forbidden to kill somebody, that means they don't want that person to die. How can there be another logic to it? So it's very, very important, very important. There's a critical time in the history of Islamic society today, both in the West and within the Islamic world, not to fall into this pit of exclusivism, which is especially stirring up the Sunni world through Saudi money that is being spent. There is new madrasas which they teach a really heretical form of Islam, which even some Muslims like Shiites are considered to be heretics, which have conferences with Christians in Saudi Arabia, but not with the Shiite population of Saudi Arabia itself, not to talk about Persians or Iraqis. That's this unfortunate situation that exists, a very, very difficult situation. Right now in the Islamic world, you have a great struggle going on inwardly between these two forces. In countries like Turkey, Iran, Indonesia, the situation is altogether very good. I mean, you might have one case like you have here of someone in Georgia breaking the window of some Muslim car or even burning a mosque. I'm not saying there's nothing, but it's not worse than the United States as far as religious minorities are concerned. At the other extreme, you have Daesh and ISIS and all of these people cutting off the heads of Christians who've lived for 1,400 years after Muslim rule in Syria. There was not one intercommunal religious fight between Muslims and Christians in Syria since the Ottoman period. Not one. Can you imagine that, how they lived at peace together? And now they're killing them all off. So there's a great struggle going on. In certain countries, things are better. Morocco also, the situation is pretty good. And in Black Africa, Senegal, places like that, there's a 13% Christian minority living in Senegal, 87% Muslim. They live at peace. They don't have any problem. But in contrast, in Nigeria, they're killing each other off every day. I mean, I'm not saying every country is in good situation. Some places in Black Africa, Ivory Coast and Senegal especially, are pretty peaceful. Morocco is in a very good situation. It's a small Christian community. Even a few of the Jews have come back from Israel. 27,000 Jews now live in Morocco. So, alhamdulillah. But in the Arab East, things are very, very bad, very difficult. And in Pakistan, it's never been like that. And especially the case of Pakistan is very tragic because Islamic India, that is Islam in India, came to India not through its Wahhabi or, there was no Wahhabi, but Arabian desert form. It came through Iran, through Persia. It was never this harsh treatment of the other. And Islam lived as a minority among a Hindu majority, creating a major empire. Was able to live with those people, which is very different from the situation in Arabia. And to import that way of things into Karachi and Lahore is devastating for the whole cultural fabric of Pakistan. Things are settling down a little bit. You know, you're a Pakistani, I'm telling you that. I just had a letter a few days ago. Things are settling down a little bit, but far from being over, of course. Whereas in Syria and Iraq and Libya, and it's just absolutely devastating. And it's very important to stand on principles. When the study of Quran that was referred to by that Mr. Casewit just came out, the first time in which I had the honor of being attacked by a person on the Riyadh television for the Quran, for being inclusivist, for not being exclusivist. That was my major sin, for having respect for other religions. But so let it be. Let's see what God decides on the Day of Judgment. That's what's important, not what the Saudi regime decides. We'll see. That's all.